We're back with The Nation. Is it time for the United States to make room for the emerging superpower that is China? That controversial question has been posed by Professor Hugh White, the head of the Australian National University Strategic and Defence Studies Centre in Canberra. The alternative, he suggests, could be a very intense rivalry, which would have repercussions for the rest of the world. Professor White is in New Zealand to speak at Victoria University's New Zealand Contemporary China Research Centre. I spoke to him earlier and began by asking him to outline how he saw the relationship at the moment between America and China.
Well, I think what we're seeing is two conflicting trends in the relationship between these two countries. On the one hand, they're becoming, if anything, more and more interdependent on one another economically, but at the same time they're becoming more and more competitors and rivals strategically, particularly because I think they both see a really fundamental difference in the kind of role they hope to play in Asia. America wants to continue to be the leader of Asia, the way it has been for many decades past, and China wants to challenge that leadership and increasingly take on a bigger leadership role of its own. So you have this strange and quite unsettling mix of deep interdependence on the one hand and increasing rivalry on the other. And my fear is that the rivalry side of the relationship is starting to predominate.
How do you see it then progressing? Well,
I think if we look back over the last few years, really since the global financial crisis, what we see is sort of progressive steps of action and reaction. China started being more assertive in the region, pushing America harder. Then America pushed back with President Obama's pivot and his policy of closer engagement in Asia and military build-up. Then from that, we moved to a Chinese response to that in turn. And I think the risk we face at the moment is that kind of action-reaction cycle at the moment, particularly over issues like the Senkakus, the dispute between Japan and China into which America's got engaged. The risk there is that will lead to escalating rivalry and perhaps even a conflict. And I think that's a disastrous outcome we all need to be very careful to try and avoid.
OK, so where does this then leave the Australia and New Zealand while all this is going on?
Well, for both of us, our future relationship with China is terrifically important to us economically and in broader ways as well. But at the same time, we both very much value our relationship with the United States, and we very much value the role that America's played in Asia for many years past, helping to stabilise the region and keeping it safe for us. And for both of us, the thing we really want to avoid is a situation where we have to make a choice between our relationships with America and our relationships with China. But of course, whether or not we're forced to make that choice, whether or not we have no option but to make that choice, will depend on how the US and China get on. And if they become more and more intense strategic rivals, if they start increasingly seeing their relationship with one another as a zero-sum game, then we will, both Australia and New Zealand, will increasingly be forced to make that kind of choice. So for us, our capacity to manage the kind of future we both want for our countries very much depends on whether the US and China can avoid this drift to escalating rivalry and find a new way to get on which ensures that, amongst other things, we in Australia and New Zealand don't have to make the kind of choice between them that we so much want to avoid.
But that's a possibility, isn't it, really? And where
yes.
do you see each country, what choice do you see each country making?
Well, I think there's a couple of things for both of us. And I think in this situation, Australia and New Zealand are pretty much in the same boat. Now, obviously, that's not always true. We do have quite significant differences in the way we approach some of these issues. But I think when we look at the US-China relationship and what it means for each of our countries, we're in fact pretty closely aligned on this one. And, you know, for both of us, I think we've got two big challenges. One is we need to try and find ways to minimise the risk that this drift to rivalry between the US and China gains momentum, and particularly the risk that it leads to some kind of conflict. And I think for both of us, that means we need to try and find a way to make whatever contribution we can to encouraging the US and China to find a new way to work with one another. We also, of course, have to ask ourselves, what would we do? What should we be doing now to manage the situation that would arise if that doesn't work and if we do end up with the US and China as strategic rivals or even adversaries? That itself would be a very serious outcome for us.
We've touched on the issue of conflict. How does the ANZUS relationship complicate things for Australia?
Oh, well, a lot is the answer. I mean, under the ANZUS alliance, if the United States finds itself in a conflict in Asia, it would expect Australian support, and I think it's been very clear and increasingly clear over the last few years that the United States looks to Australia for active military support in the event of a conflict with China, and what's more, that it's looking for more Australian support as it tries to build up its military position in Asia to respond to China's growing power. And we've seen that most obviously in the decision to base Marines in Darwin that was announced when Barack Obama was in Canberra a couple of years ago. So there's no doubt from Australia's point of view that we're kind of on the front line on this one. And for example, at the moment, we have one of our naval ships permanently based with US forces in Japan, and if there's a flare-up in the Senkaku Islands over the dispute between Japan and China into which America gets dragged, then Australia would have a very strong chance of being drawn in with it. So this is not for us a hypothetical question.
New Zealand is, of course, the only country that has a free trade agreement with Taiwan, and the Chinese, they didn't give their approval for that. They didn't give their disapproval either. So what does that tell us?
Well, I think it shows us a few things. One is I think it shows us a fair bit of agility and cleverness in New Zealand trade diplomacy, and I think the government deserves some credit for that. But it also shows that we can negotiate these things. It's not, for both of us, I think the scope for Australia and New Zealand to negotiate space for us in the very complex politics and geopolitics of the Asian century, and I think some of the kind of agility of diplomacy that New Zealand showed in achieving that agreement with Taiwan without jeopardising relations with China is an example of the sorts of things we ought to be trying to do.
So depending then what happens with America's relationship with China, presumably that would have implications for New Zealand and Australia's relationship as well.
Oh, I think so. If the US-China relationship becomes more and more adversarial, if they can't find a new way to work with one another and instead get drawn into a kind of a Cold War or even a hot war with one another, then I think both Australia and New Zealand are going to face some very tough choices. Australia is, so to speak, closer to the front line and will face those choices quicker, but I think they'll also be important for New Zealand as well. That is, how far do we support the United States if or as the United States gets drawn further and further into a more and more adversarial relationship with our biggest trading partner? And that would be a huge question for us, and of course because China's potentially so important to New Zealand as well economically, a very important question for New Zealand. On the other hand, if we chose not to support the United States, that would be, for both of us, but again, particularly for Australia, a very big step, very much contrary to our whole way of thinking about our place in the world. So this could pose countries like Australia and New Zealand some of the biggest foreign policy challenges we've ever faced in our history.
Indeed, is there a possibility that New Zealand and Australia could actually go in different directions on this?
Oh yes, there is. I think it's clearly possible that, for example, if Australia did choose to support the United States sort of all the way with the USA in opposing China, and New Zealand decided to take a more neutral stance, then I think that could constitute a very big rift in the way Australia and New Zealand saw things. But I actually think it's more likely that Australia would try and, if I can put it this way, follow New Zealand's example and avoid siding with the United States in a conflict with China unless it was absolutely unavoidable. And I think that's something that Australia would be very keen to step around if it could. So I have a feeling actually that in the long run, the rise of China and the implications of China for America's place in Asia might push Australia and New Zealand back closer together again.
That was Hugh White, Professor of Strategic Studies at the Australian National University, speaking to me earlier from Wellington.